Welcome back to the channel. Today we are out on the water and it is the pre-spawn full blown. We are at 48-degree water temperature. We were out yesterday, caught a bunch of fish on this guy right here, and today we've already caught one good one on this guy right here as well. So I figure let's talk about the top 3 baits that you need to have for pre-spawn bass fishing. I fish a lot of baits throughout the pre-spawn, but if you have these 3 right here, you can adjust them to the presentation that you're trying to fish, the water conditions, the water color, the temperature, any of that stuff, and they will always be catching fish throughout the entire pre-spawn. So stay tuned. Let's get right into it. So we're gonna do today's video a little bit differently than we do my other top baits for each month. And that is gonna be, we're actually gonna show you how to fish these baits out on the water here today. So the first one is going to be a crankbait. It is hard to beat a crankbait throughout the entire pre-spawn. I've fished it as low as 42-degree water temperature, but typically 45 and above is where this bait really starts to shine, especially once you get in that 48 to 50 range and above. That is when you absolutely have to have a crankbait on your rod. The reason behind picking all these 3 baits we're going to talk about today, and my favorite thing about a crankbait, is how adjustable it is for the water conditions. Oftentimes in the spring, you're gonna have to change your stuff a lot, change your baits, change your depth, change your color, change something, because these fish are doing the exact same thing. They are changing every single day. One day is not the same as the next. A cold front can move through, warming trend, anything can happen where these fish are always moving around, and because of that you're always going to have to be changing your baits. So the crankbait is one that you can change a lot but not change the type of bait that you're fishing. So I can fish this square bill crankbait that I have right here today. We're fishing in 48-49 degree water temperature. We have a warm sunny day, partly cloudy-ish, and the logs up shallow are in some dirtier water. So what will happen is these fish will get tight to these logs because the sun will absorb into the log, which will warm the water around the log. And because the water is dirty, they need something that they can feel comfortable against. So they'll hide up next to a log and wait for food to come by. This square bill crankbait, I can reel right through the logs, bounce it off the cover, and get it through the log, and those fish will be able to bite it. Now, on a different body of water where you have cleaner water and you don't have the sun out, it's a lot cloudier, I could go fish some rocky banks where those fish will kind of just scatter along the rocks and they can feel comfortable and chase bait, and I could go to a deeper diving crankbait in a shad color. You can pretty much do anything you want to do with a crankbait. I have oftentimes a few different ones rigged up this time of year, and I'll change based on the conditions, or I will rig them up specifically for the conditions when I get out there to the lake. But I will always have a crankbait on. It is one of my favorite baits to throw. I will throw it from about 45-degree water temperature, maybe even lower, like a shad wrap in very, very cold water, all the way up until they spawn pretty much. I'll have a crankbait on. It is just a very effective bait to cover a ton of water, and you can fish it through any type of conditions that you could possibly run into and change your bait accordingly to make sure you're catching fish. Let's head out on the water. We'll show you how to fish this square bill through some of these laydowns that are up on the bank, and how to look for types of areas that are very effective for spring bass with this crankbait, and maybe we'll catch a few along the way. So now that we talked about what makes crankbaits so effective in the pre-spawn, let's talk about how and where I want to fish these. As you can see, we have some logs laid down in the water right here. This is a perfect area to fish this crankbait in the early spring. So all I'm going to do is throw my crankbait up there and reel it down through these pieces of wood. And as it bounces off, I'm gonna pause it for 1 second, and that little 1 second delay is gonna give it a chance for the fish to see that bait. I'll throw it parallel with these logs in the water right here, and I'll go ahead and reel it down, and I want it bouncing off the cover. That is the key this time of year. Unless you're just fishing a rock bank where you're bouncing off all the rocks on the bottom, if you're fishing just any type of bank and it has wood in the water, you need that crankbait bouncing off the wood that's down on the bottom there, and that is what's gonna draw those reaction bites from these fish. That's going to catch you more fish at the end of the day. Any type of crankbait you use, you want it bouncing off of something. So even if I'm throwing something in a shad pattern, fishing down rock banks or anything like that, even if I'm fishing a rock crawler that goes 12 foot deep, I'm going to want it bouncing off the bottom at some point. You want your crankbait to go a little bit deeper than the depth of water to make sure it's bouncing off the bottom. But other than that, you want to make contact with as much cover as you can. And you can't be scared to get these crankbaits snagged in here. It's going to happen. You're going to want to throw this up in these lay down logs
and that's going to be where the fish are. So I'll whip that right up in there. I mean, I threw that over like 7-8 logs up there, and I'm going to reel it nice and slow, and it bounces off every one of them, and it'll come right back in. As long as you don't set the hook into the log, you can let it bounce over everything, and the fish are going to hook themselves. So don't worry about, is that a bite or anything. You'll know what the bite feels like with this. I mean, they will hammer this thing, especially when it bounces off a piece of wood.
So my second choice for pre-spawn bass fishing is always going to be a spinnerbait. This is something that some people throw and they love it, or other people have fallen into throwing the chatterbait and don't really throw a spinnerbait anymore. But let me tell you, the spinnerbait is still as effective as it was when it first came out. This is a super effective bait to catch a ton of fish, especially in the pre-spawn, again, because of the adaptability. So I can do pretty much anything I need to do with this spinnerbait right here. Again, we're fishing dirty water today, so I have a big spinnerbait on. I have a spinnerbait with 4 willow leaf blades on here, throws out a lot of flash. Water's not cold enough to want and dirty enough to want to go to Colorado blades, but you can go to Colorado blades if you have really dirty water or cold water. Those will throw out a lot more vibration than these blades do right here, and that will allow this fish to find the bait in dirtier water a lot easier. This one, I just have a white spinnerbait with a white trailer on here to give it a big bulky appearance, and then I have those 2 big blades, and that is enough to stand out in this slightly stained water. I'm going to fish this similar to than I do to the crankbait, and I'm going to look for those laydowns that are up on the bank where those fish can absorb that heat. They can sit on the bank and they can get some sun, and then you roll this up by them really slowly or down the laydown. This will hardly ever get hung in the laydown because of the wire. It will hit the log and it will roll over and just keep going. And when we get out on the water and actually talk about how to fish this thing, I'll show you a couple tricks when fishing it through those laydowns to get a couple more bites than you would if you just kind of casted it next to the laydown and reeled it in. But this is a super effective bait to reel through the laydowns, and the reason that I like this one more than the square bill or other crankbaits sometimes is because I can fish it slower and in colder water. So this one with the crankbait, you have to reel it fast enough to get it down to depth. This one sinks, so I can throw it out there and really slow roll this thing along the bottom and crawl it over every log. And if the fish are super lethargic, you can still catch them covering water and power fishing with a spinnerbait. You can just adjust your presentation to fish slower, or when they get very active, you can reel it even faster. And again, that plays into part of this adaptability thing that I'm talking about with some of these pre-spawn baits. So let's head out there, let's throw this thing around, and hopefully we'll catch a couple fish on this guy.
So we talked about why the spinnerbait is such an effective bait in the pre-spawn and how it is adaptable just like the other baits that we talked about. One of my favorite retrieves for fishing a spinnerbait in the pre-spawn is to find logs and stuff, just like we fish with a jig or something, or with the crankbait. You're going to find these lay down logs that are in the water. These fish still hold tight to them. No matter how cold the water gets, it's a place for them to live. There might not be as many up there, but a lot of times there'll be a few on some of these pieces of lay down wood. And what I'll do is I'll get it up there and I can just reel my bait nice and slow, just like this, just enough to keep the blades turning, and I can keep it on the bottom in the strike zone, bouncing off that wood just like a square bill would, but I can reel it a lot slower. And sometimes that slower retrieve is a lot better than having that square bill fly through the water column. I have a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait on here today, and I can keep it down there on the bottom even in this wind on a slow retrieve and just fish it nice and slow down each one of these pieces of wood. I almost fish it like a worm through each laydown. So what I'll do is I'll reel it a little bit, I'll hit a piece of wood, and I'll kill my retrieve. And when it hits that piece of wood, it'll break over it, it'll pop off, and then it'll just kind of sink back down a little bit. And when it sinks like that, it'll draw attention when it hits that piece of wood and pops off. It'll draw attention to it if there's any bass hanging nearby on that piece of wood. And when it does that and then you kill it, that gives them a second to get over there and bite it. Then it just pop over that piece of wood and keep reeling real fast.
So my last bait here, this guy's going to be for when the fishing gets tough, and oftentimes in the pre-spawn there will be a lot of tough days of fishing. Cold fronts happen, change in water conditions happen, and until those fish get used to that stuff, sometimes it can be tough fishing and you really have to slow down your presentation. So I will always have a jig tied on in the pre-spawn. It is one of my favorite ways to catch fish in the pre-spawn. It allows me to still be versatile. Like I've talked about with these other 2 baits, I can throw different types of trailers and different colors and weights to hit different depths of water, or throw different vibration or color for these fish to be able to find this bait no matter if the water is dirty or clear. And overall, it is just a bait that works excellent when the water is colder, or when you have those big weather changes that change these fish around and they don't really want to bite until they get used to it. So a lot of times if you have some rain and it really muddies up that water and you have some cold nights, those fish might kind of just hang back for a minute. They'll still be on types of wood and stuff like that. They're gonna hold tight to whatever cover they're on. They're gonna let the weather pass, and then when you have another warming trend, all of a sudden they'll just start biting good again. It's not that they weren't there 2 days ago, it's just that they weren't willing to bite. And if you're still throwing that crankbait at them, or the spinnerbait, or lipless, or something like that, you might not catch as many fish on those tougher days than you would if you slowed down and went to a jig. We'll talk a little bit about, when we get out on the water here, types of areas I like to fish this. It's very specific. However, this jig will work pretty much anywhere you fish. So if you have wood in your lake, if you have rock in your lake, it'll probably catch a fish there. It catches fish pretty much anywhere in the country. But if you have this type of cover that I'm gonna show you, it's a combination of rocks and wood, and it's a steeper looking bank. If you have this in your lake, no matter how cold the water gets, if you have a sunny day, those fish will move up on that stuff very fast. And as you can see, we got a sunny day today. Those fish will get up there to get warmth because of the steep bank. And I talked about that in a previous video. This jig is just something that I always like to have on in the spring, and we'll show you how to fish that type of cover here in just a second. So let's jump out on the water here and we'll show you how to fish this jig on some cool looking places. These fish are very predictable this time of year. If you're fishing a jig, you might not catch a ton of fish, but if you get some bites on this, they'll typically be good ones, and they'll almost always be able to call your shot wherever you're throwing this jig because of how predictable these fish are. So let's go show you what I'm talking about, hopefully catch a couple along the way.
So now that we talked about why the jig is such an effective bait in the pre-spawn, allowing you to adapt very easily, let's talk about how to fish it real fast. This is the type of stuff that I'm going to be looking for this time of year. I got logs in the water, one here, one there, one there, one there, all lined down the bank. I have some dirty water. Typically that helps, but if your lake doesn't get dirty, they'll still get on these logs. The reason they do that, I have the sun right here beating right down on these logs. That log is gonna absorb the heat. When that absorbs the heat, it'll transfer it into the water. Those fish can sit right next to that log and they'll be warmer than they can be even if they live offshore. So all I'm gonna do is flip my jig up there just like I did there. I'll let it sink right down to the bottom, and then I'm gonna drag it really slowly. And a lot of times that log is sitting there, but there's other stuff that broke off and is laying down in the water there. That is what you're targeting this time of year. So they will get tight on that stuff. They will hang very tight to these logs. So I'll pitch it up to each one. Oftentimes I'll make multiple flips. I'll kind of work my way down the log and around and just throw it at multiple angles. But the key is you want to drag it really slowly. And when you're dragging it slow like that, you'll be able to feel all the wood that's down there. As you feel that wood, you just want to keep crawling it over each piece. And oftentimes if you drop it right in front of a fish, that is when they're going to destroy it. Oftentimes if you can find a steeper bank, so this lake only gets 20 foot deep. It's not a very deep lake, but you can see I'm only this far off the bank here, maybe 20 yards. And I'm still in 8 foot of water sitting out here. So this bank is rather steep. It's not very flat. It's probably still 3 or 4 foot deep right up there on the bank. And that is what I'm looking for this time of year. Those steeper banks with some wood and dirtier water. That is what those fish are gonna hold tight to, and they're gonna hang out there until that water gets warm enough for them to go shallow. That is the perfect place to throw this jig.
So I hope you enjoyed today's video talking about my favorite pre-spawn bass fishing baits. These things excel in catching fish all throughout the pre-spawn. Like I said, they're adaptable. They allow you to catch fish no matter what the water conditions are. And if you enjoyed today's video, check out this video right here where I talked about the 5 pre-spawn bass fishing crankbaits that you need to have with you. Like I said, you want to be adaptable with those crankbaits, so those are the ones that you're going to want to have. They talk about each one, when it excels, and when you need to have which one tied on so you can catch the most amount of fish throughout the pre-spawn. So if you enjoyed today's video, leave a like down below and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any more of my fishing tips coming up. Thanks for watching.